Mikhail Gorbachev took the helm of a very sick empire. Years of war in Afghanistan, economic decline, and multiple revolts in the satellite states, the USSR was sounding its death rattles. In 1986, it experienced the most devastating nuclear accident to date, causing the Union to truly come apart at the seams. The Chernobyl disaster cost the USSR billions of dollars to clean up. Not only that, but a mass exodus occurred, displacing 300,000 people immediately. The disaster would affect a staggering 6 million. Belarus lost a full fourth of its land to the disaster, causing a loss of an estimated $700 million per year. Not to mention the fact that only a small amount of cesium-137 will be present across Europe for the next 20,000 years. Outside of the immediate 50 people that died, estimates say that 4,000 liquidators were killed from acute radiation poisoning. The Chernobyl Union, who represents liquidators, estimate 200,000 have long-term health effects due to radiation. The decades following the disaster were riddled with political strife that is still being felt today. Chernobyl was the catalyst for all of this. Hello and welcome to Come Hell or Heavy Water, where we talk about nuclear history, bombs, energy, and accidents. I'm your host, Nathan Coggeshall. Last episode, we talked about the immediate effects of the Chernobyl disaster, how it happened, who was affected, and how it was contained. Today we are going to talk about the after effects, social, economic, political, and ecological. The cost. Something I really didn't even brush up on in episode 1 was how much the disaster cost the Soviet Union and is now costing the Ukraine. At this point in the USSR's timeline, with Afghanistan, nearly 70% of its industrial capacity went towards the military. Point being, they were at a breaking point. Arguably, Chernobyl was the nail in the coffin for the Soviet economy, and in turn the Soviet Union. However, calculating the total cost is tricky. Since 1986, there have been complete changes in the political landscape of Eastern Europe, and with that, new economies. Not only that, but nuclear accidents are like onions. They have a lot of layers, stay around forever, and nobody really likes them. There were the immediate short-term costs, i.e. decontamination, cleanup, and health costs just to scratch the surface, and there were the long-term costs, i.e. healthcare, decommissioning, and finding new sources of power for the area. The IAEA held an all-union conference and came up with a $6.8 billion for the immediate effects. Here are some examples from that receipt. Treatment of contaminated areas. Belarus, 1986 to 2015, $12.85 billion. Decontamination of contaminated areas. Belarus, 1986-2015, $36.83 billion. Cleaning activities, decontamination, and building of the sarcophagus, and over 20,000 new houses and 15,000 new flats. Ukraine, $17 billion. The Soviets would have to shell out a whole $20 billion by 1989 for the construction and decontamination. To put that into perspective, the Soviet-Afghan War, which was now in its 7th year, cost only $14 billion. So they spent more in 3 years to clean up Chernobyl than they did fighting their forever war. Again, about 70% of the industrial output of the USSR was being put into the military. The sheer weight of turning those wheels must have been immense. Now to follow up. The long-term costs. Here are some examples from that receipt. Expenditures for the Unified State Program and protection of the population of the Russian Federation from the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, 1992 to 1995. Russia, $1.2 billion. Budget expenditures, 1992 to 2000. Ukraine, $5.4 billion. Public health protection and provision of specialized medical care, 1992 to 1995. $17.8 million. Another category of economic loss would be that of land and opportunities that were lost. Economic losses from just the agricultural sector at the 25-year mark for Belarus are a staggering $235 billion. The Ukraine, $198 billion. And Russia at about the same. This gives us a ballpark look at how much of the disaster cost 25 years down the line. $700 billion lost. To put that into perspective, Saudi Arabia's GDP is $683.82 billion. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine have lost more money than Saudi Arabia is worth due to this accident. And that's just money they can no longer earn, not from what they spent cleaning it up, just to clarify. So the USSR had a very big check to write, and the bank wasn't exactly full for them at this point. They did what they did best, and cost cut. As we explored last episode, the sarcophagus was just as shoddily built as the RBMK reactors themselves. The new safe confinement wasn't exactly cheap either. $1.6 billion for the arch itself, and another $0.7 billion for the actual implementation of the shield. But happily for the Ukraine, they didn't have to pay out of pocket. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development funded the project, founding the Chernobyl Shelter Fund in 1997. The G7, EU, and Ukraine would all fund the project rather than letting Ukraine face the problem on her own. I'm going to get philosophical here for a second, so bear with me. It's nice to see these states who had seemingly been at each other's throats for a whole 70 years come together to help with such a monumental task. The West legitimately could have left Ukraine to her own devices, but we decided to help out. Yes, Chernobyl is a risk for all of Europe, but Ukraine and Belarus are the states with the gun to their head. I just think it's nice to see all these big powers team up behind such small states to help however they can. It's a small glimmer of hope in a world where international organizations are increasingly viewed with suspicion. This is a nice segue to my next point. The human cost. It's going to start out fairly sad, but there is a strange bright side to the social aspects of the disaster. I'm going to throw some numbers out. When the exclusion zone was set up, 116,000 people from 170 villages left their homes. In Kiev, 2.3 million people were exposed to radiation from atmospheric drift. 338,000 Belarusians left the land that their families had tilled for generations. In all, some 5 million people were affected, whether from direct evacuation, exposure to radiation, or through work during the cleanup. So we're going to first look at the Belarusians who were affected, as they are mostly skimmed over when discussing Chernobyl. So right after the explosion, a southerly wind pushed 70% of the radioactive cloud over Belarus. This contaminated a whole 23% of Belarus's land, in comparison to only 4.8% of the Ukraine's. Side note, Belarus is sort of a dictatorship. Since 1994, the same man, Alexander Lukashenko, has ruled the country. Even with the public knowledge that a whole fourth of his land is contaminated with cesium-137, which is the radioactive isotope that is prominent from this disaster, there are no medical records on how this has affected the general populace. The government did set up a so-called Poletsky State Radiological Reserve, where they monitor the habitat and how the ecosystem is reacting to contamination. But, of course, this data is under strict lock and key and not available to the public. Lukashenko has been basically hell-bent on getting some of that land back as well. Since the disaster, a whole 1.3 million people still live in the exclusion zone, farming regularly with seemingly no health risk. But again, this is through Belarusian documentation. Resettlement in contaminated areas has been ongoing since 2003, and farming has even started to happen again. I know how crazy that sounds, so I'll say it again. The Belarusian government has been farming in the Chernobyl exclusion zone for 16 years. At first it started with wheat, barley, and this fancy grain with a horrible name, rapeseed. Rapeseed, when cultivated properly, absorbs cesium-137, and apparently it just magically disappears. This is because it's a cesium binder. Radiation monitoring of the 1,400-ton crop read that there wasn't any. Checkpoints 150 miles away from the plant began to disappear, and people flocked back to the land which was now seemingly arable. Farms began raising cattle for beef in 2005. Lukashenko then declared that the land, quote, should work for the country, whatever that meant. A report released by the government claimed that the land was now safe to live and work on, and further encouraged Russia and the Ukraine to look at their exclusion zones a little bit harder, which they did. Go figure, the land still isn't safe. Greenpeace claimed that the report was whitewash, and even Lukashenko's scientific minister on Chernobyl, Valery Gorochevsky, claimed the report to be too optimistic. But 7 United Nations committees and the World Bank began to believe Mr. Lukashenko. As of 2005, 54 miles of the 1,000 miles of contaminated land had been resettled, but that number has grown. Since the cultivations of grain has started and cattle were introduced, milk has also begun production in the zone once again. On the edge of the contaminated zone, well, Belarus's newly declared contaminated zone, a milk farm sprung up. According to CBS, the milk was tested for radiation and read 10 times higher than the consumable level. Of course, the farmer who makes 50 tons of milk a day said otherwise. The milk is then sent out to Russia along with Parmesan cheese. But enough about a dictator's fever dream of reclaiming contaminated land. It's about to get sad. Children were affected worse by contamination. 500,000 children still live in contaminated zones inside of Belarus. Ukraine alone has registered 453,391 children who have some illness linked to Chernobyl. A myriad of health problems plague these children: respiratory, digestive, musculoskeletal, eye, blood diseases, cancer, congenital malformations, genital abnormalities, and trauma. None of them were born before the disaster. In January 1991, a desperate fax was sent to anyone who would receive it. Audie Roche, who was working in a nuclear disarmament NGO, read the fax. To her disbelief, it was from Ukrainian and Belarusian doctors pleading for anybody to take children out of the zone. Chernobyl Children was set up and began working specifically to help children out of the zone and receive proper medical care. Children who drank contaminated milk or ate contaminated food were now at an incredibly high risk of developing thyroid cancer. Between 1992 and 2001, 15 people died due to thyroid cancer caused by exposure during the accident. At the time, they were children. In total, more than 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer are linked to exposure between 1992 and 2002. These children only know disease their entire lives because of some almost mythical apocalyptic event that happened before they were born. Before we move on to how Ukrainians were affected, I want to go back to the point I made earlier, the strange brighter side to all of this. Ukraine and Belarus have been in a sort of limbo of East versus West since the collapse of the USSR. Belarus has leaned more to the east, with its pseudo-dictator being Putin's little puppet. Excuse me for getting political there. Ukraine has moved more west, which could be seen in both the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution. So how does all this pie-in-the-sky political jargon tie into the children affected by Chernobyl? Well, they and their parents have been moving west, even out of Belarus. A not-so-elegantly named study titled Chernobyl Responsibility and National Identity, Positioning Europe and Russia in the Media of Belarus and Ukraine, 1992 to 2014, by Ekaterina Zhukova points this out. I'm going to focus on the Belarusian side to this, as they had historically viewed Europe as an enemy and Russia as a friend. But rather than lumping all of Europe into the bad guys category, the official Belarusian media seemed split. They outright would blame the EU and its institutions, saying things along the lines of, "You don't care about us." On the other hand, specific states, governments, businesses, charities, and citizens were praised. Austria, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, and the Netherlands were all mentioned by name for helping the children of Chernobyl. Belarus felt they provided help without imposing conditions and or promoting values. A Belarusian journalist, when receiving children from Berlin, said, quote, "The Chernobyl children were the first pool of post-Soviet kids who systemically and in large numbers traveled to Western Europe. The impressions received at such an early age left a magnificent impact on our future life goals." To me, that screams that Belarus is seated for democracy within a generation. With that in mind, let's move on to the Ukrainians who were affected. We talked last episode about the exodus of people out of the zone and where they went. A little recap. Most of them went to population centers and lived with other evacuees normally on the same street. People were afraid of them, and oftentimes they had trouble finding jobs, friends, and starting families. Many folks exposed figured they would never be able to have children even if they wanted to, both due to radiation and the strange stigma that surrounded these poor souls. However, there isn't a link between radiation and reproductive health, although pregnancies would often result in miscarriages and or the infant passing if they were exposed in the womb. The evacuations didn't begin until 36 hours after the explosion. The day following is just bizarre. It was a beautiful spring day, close to May Day, so people were out and about. The city directors were flushed with calls from various different schools, stores, and administrations asking if it was still safe to proceed with plans, and of course, they said it was. Vladimir Mulisov, second in charge for the party in Kiev, was the one who told people to continue as though there was nothing wrong. Quote, "There was an accident. The conditions are being evaluated right now. When we know more details, we'll let you know. And please do not panic. Under no circumstances should you panic." Unquote. The public was quelled and the day continued on as normal. 7 weddings occurred. The young pioneers didn't cancel their meeting at the Palace of Culture that day. May Day was encouraging and people were encouraged to continue their preparations. The holidays in the USSR were much different than in the US or even Western Europe. They were the week between the 1st of May and the 9th of May, commemorating the end of World War II. Celebrations were planned in Kiev for the holiday. It was important for the government not to cause panic, so celebrations were not canceled. Party officials who knew of the disaster were given iodine tablets to curb the effects of radiation. They gave them to their children. Citizens were not informed until after the celebration, and by that point it was too late. An evacuee, Ludmila Polyenka, was moved to Kiev and met her friend who was a doctor. Her doctor friend was fervently telling her to take her kids and run, knowing full well that there were high levels of radiation in the city. They went tit for tat. Ludmila said, quote, "What would happen if everyone behaved like you? Would we have won the war?" The doctor replied, "You're a traitor to your children. Where's your maternal instinct, fanatic?" Now quoting Ludmila after the fact. And everyone's sense, including mine, was that my doctor friend was panicking. We needed to wait until somebody told us, until they announced it. But she was a doctor. She knew more. You can't even defend your own children. No one's threatening them, but you're afraid anyway. Oh, how we hated her at that moment. She ruined the whole evening for us. The next day she left. and we dressed up our kids and took them to the May Day demonstration." Unquote. Seeing a party official and his daughter, she said, "She was wearing a raincoat and a hat, even though it was sunny out, and he was wearing a military trench coat. And of course they didn't provide much protection, but it was more than the festive costumes that citizens wore. Imagine the scene. A gorgeous day for a holiday. The parade moving down the street with children and families smiling. Portraits of Stalin and Lenin moved down the block being toted by grinning performers. The whole time they're being overseen by the big cats watching them, knowing completely that every one of them is being exposed to radionuclides. They stood there waving in their heavy-duty trench coats with their children who were afforded the luxury of iodine tablets to minimize the effects of radiation. If you're looking for a villain in all of this, it's party officials. These men knew of the danger civilians were in, and they refused to tell anybody of it. Plant workers did not cause people to be exposed. It was men in the top. Not only were the physical effects detrimental, but the psyche of the people affected was racked. I'm going straight into a quote. "We're afraid of everything. We're afraid for our children and our grandchildren, who don't exist yet. They don't exist and we're already afraid. People smile less. They sing less on holidays. The landscape changes. Because instead of fields, the forests rise up again. But the national character changes too. Everybody's depressed. It's a feeling of doom. Chernobyl is a metaphor, a symbol, and it's changed our everyday life and our thinking." That's from Nadshav Burakov, who lives in the village of Kolyank in Belarus. Another. "Everyone called them heroes. It's impossible to suffer like this without any meaning, without any of the old words, even without the medal they gave him. It's there at home. He gave it to our son. I know there's one thing. I'll never be happy again." This is from Nina Koryalev. I'm quoting Voices from Chernobyl again. It's an amazing book which encompasses untold stories brought by Chernobyl. I highly recommend anybody interested in the disaster to read it. Depression, trauma, and PTSD ran rampant through the people who were exposed. As mentioned in the previous episode, suicide has become prevalent amongst former liquidators. The men who cleaned up the area have a slew of health problems, and now they have been essentially forgotten by their government. At first, these men were praised as heroes by their government, but over the years their government not only collapsed, but changed drastically. That's not an excuse to forget about their sacrifice, however. Liquidators have been voicing for recognition and help from their new respected governments for a while now. Their pleas fall on deaf ears. Now, since not many of us are familiar with annual dosage rates for radiation, I'm going to put the liquidators' dosage into perspective a bit. Average annual exposure for pretty much anybody not living in an area of high background radiation is about 2.4 millisieverts annually. All humans are exposed to radiation throughout their life in natural ways like the sun, naturally occurring elements in our food, drink, and air. Liquidators working between 1986 through 87 receives an average of 100 millisieverts per hour. That's about what normal humans receive in over 50 years, but not from the incredibly poisonous and dangerous cesium-137. It's also important to note that they were exposed mainly to gamma radiation, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the most dangerous of all types. The Soviet government admitted to 28 deaths from acute radiation sickness and claimed another 106 were cured. The health risk didn't stop at radiation sickness. Cancer, leukemia, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and an innumerable amount of mental health problems. The chance of a liquidator getting leukemia is double than that of somebody who has never been exposed to radiation. Thyroid cancer has also been statistically higher in liquidators. A small link to exposure and premenopausal breast cancer has been made between exposure from the plant and the women who were exposed. It's expected that another 5,000 cancer deaths will be caused from exposure to radiation, or about 0.6 of all cancer deaths. The lens of the eye is very sensitive to ionizing radiations. Others exposed to radiation, i.e. atomic bomb victims, astronauts, and those who get CT scans of the head, have a heightened risk of developing cataracts. The liquidators were no different. A dose as little as 2 millisieverts per hour is enough to cause cataracts, with some liquidators being exposed to amounts of radiation hundreds of times higher than that. Essentially, the higher the dosage, the quicker the cataract will form. A whole 25% of liquidators developed cataracts. A Russian study followed 53,772 liquidators who entered the zone in 1986 and left in 87. It claims during a follow-up period between 1997 and 2012, 27,456 cases of cardiovascular disease were diagnosed amongst the population surveyed. The link between radiation and cardiovascular disease is yet to be further explored. The World Health Organization says, quote, While this finding needs further study with longer follow-up times, it is consistent with other studies. For example, on radiotherapy patients who received considerably higher doses to the heart." Unquote. Essentially, they need to look closer at it before drawing any conclusions, but it doesn't seem too far-fetched to me. On the other side of mental health, we're going to start with the label that people use for those affected: victims. This label has led to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. High levels of stress and anxiety are continually reported from liquidators to this day. An Estonian study has found an increase in clinical diagnoses of nervous system disorders and self-harm amongst liquidators. This coincides with the Ukrainian study, which mapped an increase in common psychological disorders and increased suicidal tendencies amongst liquidators. PTSD has also had a statistically high rate amongst liquidators and their children as well. Psychological effects from the disaster can be akin to those who survived the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shifting back to the civilian population, trauma was also caused by being forced to leave their homes. It's sort of a joke that once you go into the zone, it calls you back, and you need, not want, to go back. This need was felt by the people who lived there and built their families there. People have begun to return to the zone whether they're allowed to or not. It's mainly been older people, especially women. Even if it is poisoned with radiation, it is still my home. There's no place else that needs us. Even a bird loves its nest. These women have been lovingly nicknamed the babushkas of Chernobyl. A film which coined the name goes into their various homes and see how they live. Only a very small population in the hundreds still live inside of the zone, and they do so just as they did before the disaster. They have small gardens, forage for food, fish, make wine, and essentially everything you're not supposed to do in a radioactive environment. The community is very tight-knit, and they all seem to get along just fine. Doctors' visits are regular, and strangely enough, they're as healthy as old women can be. Journalists and guides who regularly visit are told not to eat anything offered to them, but anyone who has a grandma knows it's hard to resist. Quote, "We are forced to eat. I mean, all old ladies and grandmothers have to feed their guests here. Only then they are persuaded you are happy, and their duty has been fulfilled. Otherwise they get insulted, lethally insulted. I know there are risks, but as for the babushkas, I can't say no, yeah? Just eat the minimum you can, drink the minimum you can, and that's it." Unquote. This quote is from Vida Polyankov, who is a government guide inside of the zone. She regularly visits the babushkas, and they treat her like a granddaughter. Specialists have also come in to measure the food they eat, and of course it's all contaminated to some degree, but again, with no adverse health effects. There are at least 5 million different stories from Chernobyl just from the people that lived through it, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the political effects of the disaster. Gorbachev even said that the disaster led to the collapse of the USSR. I'm going to start off by explaining the political fallout, pardon the pun, by describing the Soviet Union's political standing at the time, as well as the general culture amongst politicians. The Soviet leadership was called the Central Committee and/or the Politburo. It was full of the top ministers and military brass. They operated on secrecy and propaganda to control the populace along with the information that reached them. With Gorbachev in charge, and change was in the air. Glasnost was initiated in 1985, which was a policy to make the government more open and consultative, along with the new access to information. But this was not the case for Chernobyl. The Challenger explosion only occurred 3 months before the disaster at Chernobyl. Differences between the reaction from a Soviet versus American governments is stark. Reagan came on air the night of the explosion and expressed condolences along with expressing his continued support of space exploration. When Gorbachev was confronted with his own disaster, there was no special newsreel, no announcements, nothing Glasnost promised. In fact, it wasn't until the Monday following when the national news, Veryema, said anything. 9 p.m. the newsreel said, quote, "An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. One of the 4 atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of an accident. Victims are being helped. A government commission has been created." Unquote. And that was it until May 14th when Gorbachev finally addressed the nation. So why did it take so long for Gorbachev, someone who essentially wanted to thaw the country and allow information to spread, to actually say anything? Well, declassified Politburo documents show a surreal and strange bureaucratic pipeline that led to this delay. First report of the explosion came at 2:20 a.m. to Sergei Eremenko. From there, it wasn't until 6 a.m. when the Energy Ministry telephoned Gorbachev's premier, Nikolai Ryzhkov, when he informed Gorbachev himself. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. 2 days of confusion followed. Reports were coming in from all over Kiev, and none of them were confirming the other reports. The military was on scene almost immediately, and even reported the fire to be out by 6 a.m. We, of course, know that it burned for a full 10 days. Reports were also coming into Gorbachev saying the situation, quote, seems serious, but he didn't seem to react any differently, keeping the Monday meeting time. One report even stated that only a cooling tank had exploded and no radiation leaks were caused from it. This was in direct confrontation from eyewitnesses who knew the reactor had blown and reported that it had blown. 2 Politburo members went to the site and only said that the top of the reactor had been cracked. While all of this is happening, foreign correspondents were rummaging around for any information that they could find. The New York Post picked up a very shaky lead stating that 2,000 people had died in the explosion. Headlines read, 2,000 die in nuke mare. Soviets appeal for help as end plant burns out of control. While 2/3 of that headline is falsified, Americans aided up. In reality, Americans offered aid on the same day the news article was published, but of course, the Soviets denied it on the basis of national pride. And that gets a segue to my next point, egos. All of the Politburo had enormous egos, and this caused slow release of information and acceptance of aid. It was felt that this was a Soviet problem and could be fixed with Soviet solutions. We know now that any aid coming in from anybody would have been a huge help. The plant lacked radiation suits, had only a few dosimeters, the Union itself had no robots at all to clean up, though this changed quickly. National pride and/or just egos really caused the lack of information getting to the public. Sectionalism also sprouted up in the Politburo in the days following the disaster. Reformers wanted as much correct information to be given to the public as soon as possible, which was around the 29th. Traditionalists, on the other hand, wanted to keep everything under lock and key and pretend like nothing had happened, or at least to downplay the accident. May 6th, after a few days of investigation, Pravda, the Soviet state newspaper, published a lengthy article discussing the accident. This was a win for Glasnost after a week or so of failures. From then on, the Politburo said hell to the traditionalists and began to override the old censorship guidelines. Foreign correspondents were then allowed into the zone and information began to stream out steadily, culminating in Gorbachev's May 14th broadcast. The disaster was at first a failure for Glasnost, and it's important to understand why. It wasn't necessarily because of Gorbachev, though he did have multiple opportunities to discuss the disaster. The first few days, the information coming in from the official channels was convoluted and confusing at best. Reports were contradicting each other, and there wasn't much to go off of other than hearsay. Side note, this does not excuse the delayed evacuation of Pripyat. Any incidents of an accident at a nuclear plant should be followed by an immediate evacuation of the surrounding areas. Numbers were available on the ground, and people knew of the danger and decided not to tell citizens to avoid panic. Not only were the initial reports confusing, but the infighting inside the Politburo was destabilizing Gorbachev's government. He had only been in office for a year, and his hold on power wasn't exactly secure. The culture of repression and secrecy ran deep, and going against that could have been the end of Gorbachev. But in the end, he did so anyway, and began to tell people what had really happened. We historians aren't exactly fans or supporters of the idea that any significant event had one cause, but Chernobyl was probably one of the first cracks in the Soviet system that led to its downfall. As I said earlier, the Soviets had been in Afghanistan for about 7 years when the disaster occurred, and just like here in the US, the populace wasn't exactly fond of their forever war either. Not only that, but the Soviet economy had been stagnating for almost 2 decades at that point. The GDP per capita in 1986 was about $7,000. Now, Soviet citizens didn't have to worry about healthcare, education, and other basic services, which we have to shell out a lot of money for. Even with that in mind, humans are material beings, and the West had been leaking into the Union for a while now. People wanted modern appliances, cars, clothes, and most importantly, a new political system that worked for them. When the power plant erupted, the populace seemingly awakened at least somewhat. Calls were heard for greater access to information and a more open government, even with Glasnost's already official policy. Glasnost was more of a general idea. Gorbachev stressed talking about the country's problems, but Chernobyl was something much more different than what he had expected. Chernobyl was huge, and could not be hidden from public eye. In the mid-80s, the Soviets legitimately thought they were still a superpower only in competition with the US. When information about Chernobyl started to leak, it showed how grossly incompetent and inept the Soviet political system was. This caused people to begin to lose faith in the system which they did actually believe in and hope to fix. However, the explosion solidified that the government was unforgivable. They refused to help the people that were affected and failed to keep their citizens safe. I know it's ironic because the government was responsible for the murder and imprisonment of millions of its citizens during Stalin's time, but by 1986 there was change in the air, and people wanted that change. Now I'm going to start talking about freedom in big quotes. While at the surface level the West is a beacon for freedom and liberty, that's probably not the real case. I'm not going to go into that more because that's out of the scope of this podcast, but basically the Soviet citizens also wanted that freedom. Chernobyl was a catalyst for people to really start questioning their government and to call for more of those freedoms, i.e. freedom of information and the freedom from fear. People were starting to get angry and Gorbachev knew it. Their government had failed them, and for the first time in the USSR's history, citizens didn't feel forgiving. While there weren't mass demonstrations in Moscow or Kiev over Chernobyl, as those wouldn't be for a few more years and for different reasons, Chernobyl became a huge side in the ailing political system. More like an axe to the head in my opinion. As stated earlier, the Soviets had to pour in a huge amount of money to contain the radiation, which really also didn't help their failing economy. Chernobyl was when cracks really started to show in how the Soviet system was ran. The culture of secrecy over public health was what really caused people to be upset, especially with the new promises of glasnost. Not only that, but the bumbling response following the disaster also made people upset, and for once they felt that their government was unforgivable. The collapse of the USSR wasn't only because of Chernobyl. Multiple issues plagued the system and Chernobyl symbolized them rather than created them. It was only another 4 years till the First Republic declared independence from the Union and the true collapse began. Chernobyl also had political implications outside of the USSR. Since the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, the anti-nuclear movement had been growing more vocal and much larger. Protests against nuclear energy were not just localized to the US either. They began to spread to Western Europe as well. Strangely enough, these movements coincided with anti-NATO protests in Western Europe. These were protests against nuclear armament mainly, not so much nuclear power. That being said, when Chernobyl blew up, so did the anti-nuclear movement. It grew mainly through grassroots efforts, and they used Chernobyl as sort of a rallying cry. Chernobyl was a symbol of what would happen if the atom left our control, and people were scared. Whether they were rightfully scared is not my decision to make. I do plan on having an episode on safety culture and pros and cons of nuclear energy. Governments across Europe began to shut down planned reactors, and Soviet satellites shut down other RBMK reactors that were still running. The West German government, which had a fairly apathetic policy of don't build or don't shut down, started to waver. Public support of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany was huge, and the only other party that supported nuclear growth, the SPD, opted for the closure of all nuclear facilities in Germany starting in 1988. A controversial reactor reached criticality outside of Hamburg only 6 weeks after the Chernobyl meltdown. The Burgdorf reactor was shut down in 1989. On June 7, 1986, massive anti-nuclear protests consisting of 100,000 people sprung up at a construction site at Wackersdorf reprocessing facility, and by 1989, the site was closed. On the same day, 70,000 people showed up at the door of the Burgdorf reactor, which ultimately led to its closure in 1989 as well. Anti-nuclear protests would eventually become more frequent, though less in numbers, in the Netherlands, the UK, Italy, and the US. Eventually, Russians started to protest their reactors, most notably the Leningrad, Rostov, and Vornishev plants. Subsequent protests also prevented the construction of another 5 reactors. On the other side of the debate, proprietors of nuclear energy would point to the engineering flaws in the reactors and the human component of Chernobyl. Arguments go along the lines of, yes, this happened, but we know why and how, and now can prevent accidents like this from happening in the future. To some extent, they were right. Nuclear regulatory committees strengthened safety requirements, refurbished old plants, and implemented new layers of defense against meltdowns. Through my eyes, they've worked. We have not had an accident on the scale of Chernobyl for the same reason since 1986. People like to point at Fukushima, showing how the atom is ultimately out of control, but the natural factors that played into Fukushima were practically unavoidable. Not only that, but the sister planet of Daiichi, Daini, experienced the same factors and managed to avoid meltdowns. We're getting away from Chernobyl, but point being, with the right people and the right circumstances, even with all the odds against you, nuclear catastrophes can be avoided. But enough about politics. How did Chernobyl affect the environment? We talked last episode about how Chernobyl will be uninhabitable for the next 20,000 years, and we mentioned earlier that what nucleoids are present. Cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90, and plutonium-241 are all present in the exclusion zone. The most present and most dangerous is cesium-137, which emits both beta and gamma radiation. The half-life is only 30 years, which has passed, but it is still dangerous to life through intake for about another 100 years. The number of 20,000 is a result of the combination of all the different isotopes rather than just a single one. Plutonium-241 is the most toxic of the particles and has the longest decay chain, and only then does it decay to americonium-241. But the decay chain, which is a fancy way of summarizing the elements that the particles decay into, will last about 24,000 years. These two isotopes have been linked to both cancer and lung fibrosis. Iodine-131 only has a half-life of 8 days, but because the half-life is so short, it is highly radioactive. This isotope is the main one responsible for the uptick in thyroid cancer. Strontium-90 has a half-life of 28 years but is still dangerous through ingestion. This particle is known as a bone seeker, and while about 70 or 80% of the dose is normally exerted, the remaining dose is absorbed in calcium in your bones. This leads to bone cancers, cancer in nearby tissues, and leukemia. Now that we have our cast of characters, let's look at the stage. I'll skim over this as the size of the zone has rehashed almost every mention of Chernobyl. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone encompasses about 2,600 square kilometers of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus. People work and live there along with local wildlife. Maps of radiation contamination are frequently made, with the most contaminated areas being to the north and to the west. The epicenter of it all is the plant. We brushed on the Red Forest last episode, but it's important to go into again. When the trees were buried from the original forest, new ones were introduced, mainly Scots pines. They were known to have a reddish hue to their bark, yet the color of the trees in Chernobyl is much darker, creating an almost alien landscape. The Red Forest got a lot of its radiation dumped onto it, and also has the burden of being the gravesite for debris from the plant, along with contaminated trees. Birds have smaller brains, the trees grow slower, and there's a startling lack of insects and spiders. Something strange is also happening in the Red Forest. The trees that died from radiation poisoning weren't decomposing. Biologists began to look into this in 1991 and found that fungi life in the zone had been affected by contamination. They took baggies of different leaves and scattered them around the zone, in areas with no contamination and in areas of high contamination. Of course, the areas with no contamination, the leaves decayed pretty much as expected, losing about 80% of their weight. In areas of high contamination, the leaves retained 60% of their original weight. This was done over a year, more than enough time for leaves to decay. This poses a very scary problem. 25 years of leaves sitting on a forest floor, not decaying. If a forest fire broke out, radiation could be spread around once again, with smoke taking it God knows where. The only solution right now is to sternly look at the highly radioactive leaves and say, don't catch on fire. Water bodies also absorb significant amounts of radiation in the first weeks following the meltdown. Contamination of water rapidly decreased through the dilution, decay, and the absorption of nucleoids into sediment and soils. The river Pripyat runs directly by the plant into the river Dnieper. The Dnieper supplies water to most of the Ukraine, and the high levels of contamination were recorded following the meltdown. This was a cause for alarm, but new water eventually diluted these contaminations as well. Rivers and lakes that are wholly in the exclusion zone are going to be contaminated for much longer because of the nearly constant exposure to radiation. Fish in the water absorbed radiation quickly, and through the fancy process of bioaccumulation, the concentration of cesium-137 is high in fish of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Lakes as far away as Scandinavia and Germany have also found contaminated fish. A worker, who only goes by BioNerd23 in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, ran a YouTube channel where she would explore the zone and filmed unfilmed parts of it. She posted a video in August of 2017 showing the catfish that were living in the cooling pond of the plant. I believe they were Wells catfish, which are already known to get about 370 pounds at a possible length of 16 feet. Seems just fine in the cooling pond. Indications that the catfish were being harmed by the radiation would be finding skimpy, sick, or dead ones. Yet that doesn't happen. The catfish in the cooling pond have ample food, no predators, a classic catfish utopia. Yes, these catfish are huge, but that's not because of radiation. These catfish are frequented by tourists who love to feed them. In BioNerd's video, when she tries to feed them, they seem to be full, spitting out what she throws in for them. Fishing is strictly monitored in the zone, with the only reasons allowing fishing being research. The fish in the area are far too contaminated to eat. Stepping back to our babushkas of Chernobyl, the opening scene of the film has a singing babushka going to the river and catching some fish for consumption. Again, these people have routine health checks and find limited radiation in their bodies. That begs the question, are the fish in Chernobyl safe to eat? Studies say no, but babushkas say yes. If it were me, I wouldn't come close to that fish, even if it was fried up. The animals of the zone had a fairly rough time following the meltdown. We went over how hunting squads had to get rid of domesticated pets and livestock in the last episode. But of course, you can't get them all. Cats and dogs still roam the zone as strays, the dogs frequently moving in packs. The SCPAI estimate that 250 dogs live in the plant itself, and another 225 in Pripyat. They expected another 1,000 or so to be living in and around the zone. The Clear Futures Fund, a foundation set up by the SCPAI, has 3,500 employees that tend to the dogs, giving them food, shelter, water, and care. Since 2018, the fund has cleared 200 dogs for adoption in the Ukraine and another 12 being sent to the United States. The dogs are thoroughly cleaned, removing any contaminants, and quarantined for 45 days before being cleared for adoption. There has also been no evidence of the contamination harming the dogs, though there has been evidence of increased cataracts in wolves. Cats are a bit harder to track because they are so sneaky, but about 600 of them have been cleared for adoption since 2018, after being given vaccines and being spayed and neutered. Predators have also been affected by the plant, but in a strange way. European gray wolves, which were not necessarily even native to Ukraine, started to move into the zone. The lack of humans and ample prey led to an explosion in population inside of the zone. From the outside, the wolves look incredibly healthy and happy. Little is known about the effects that radiation is having on them in the long term, and researchers are attempting to monitor the health of these wolves now. There is a bit of worry of them leaving the zone, for the same reason people were worried about other animals leaving the zone. The potential of spreading radiation through dust caught in the fur is a real concern, and wolves are known to go on long treks to find a mate. One wolf that was tagged in the exclusion zone went on a 250-mile journey across the Ukrainian border into Belarus and then into Russia. There is evidence that they do leave the zone. There's a great song called Wolves of Chernobyl. Highly recommend a listen. The white-tailed eagle has also made a comeback in the area, which was rarely seen before. Owls have made their homes in the abandoned buildings, and their population has also rose. It seems like everybody knows about Chernobyl's boars, but we'll talk about them anyway. Boars love to eat mushrooms, but fungi is known to absorb radiation through the ground. Not only that, but fungi are huge organisms, the largest ever discovered, covering 6.4 square kilometers. The problem with this is that when fungi is growing in an uncontaminated area of the zone, it might be growing in a highly radioactive place somewhere else. When the boars eat the mushroom, they absorb radiation. And these radioactive boars are definitely moving out of the zone. Between 2014 and 16 in Chechnya, 614 boars were deemed to be too radioactive to eat. In Germany, 1 out of every 3 boars hunted is deemed unfit for consumption due to radiation. As far away as Sweden, 30 boars have been tested and only 6 were at acceptable levels. That fear about animals leaving the zone is justified, though there is not much we can do other than monitor. Lastly, the Perelevsky horse, a wild horse native to the Eurasian plains, was nearly extinct, but in 1989 they were introduced into the zone in a last-ditch effort for repopulation. The first batch of horses passed due to stress, not radiation. Another 20 were introduced and the population leveled off at about 65 and started to decrease again, this time due to the explosion in the wolf population. Since they were introduced, scientists have kept a close eye on them, and they have weirdly shown no adverse health effects of radiation poisoning and are continuing to produce healthy offspring. While all of this is well and good, meaning the wildlife of Chernobyl are seemingly making a comeback and healthy, it is overshadowed by the fact that this was a man-made ecological disaster. I cannot stress enough that this land will be uninhabitable for 20,000 years. The radiation that leaked from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the largest release of radiation into our environment ever. 5% of the core decayed and was released into the air, earth, and water. Yes, it is nice that the animals have a new place for them to live undisturbed, but nothing about Chernobyl is rosy because of its huge environmental impact. In 2 episodes and in about 40 pages of writing, I've barely touched the tip of the iceberg on Chernobyl. The disaster shaped a generation and helped bring down one of the most villainous governments ever. The amount of stories, data, research, and time that has gone into recording what had happened is immense and seemingly endless. Chernobyl will be with us for the next 20,000 years, and we are going to have to keep monitoring, studying, and learning everything it can teach us so that we can avoid something like this from happening again. Thank you all for listening. This has been Nathan Coggeshall with Come Hell or Heavy Water. Stay safe out there, stalker.